You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast with host Dan Heaton. My guest today on the Tomorrow Society podcast is Chad Emerson, who's the author of Project Future, the inside story behind the creation of Disney World. And he's the editor of 4 Decades of Magic, celebrating the first 40 years of Disney World. Chad also writes the Large Park News column for Tourist Attractions and Parks magazine. And he has an inside scoop in a lot of ways on what's currently going on with Disney in particular, but also in Orlando. You may know Chad's name from his appearances on a lot of other podcasts, particularly the Season Pass podcast, which is where I really know Chad from. And he has a really interesting perspective from the industry side that we don't always hear in terms of the Disney news and the way it's covered on podcast and online. And this was a really cool conversation for me because there were some rumors and possible news going forward that Chad talked about that I wasn't aware of. And I think he brings a really smart perspective on the industry and where Disney in particular is heading. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. It starts in just a minute. Okay, well, my guest today is Chad Emerson, who's the author of the book Project Future. He's been covering theme parks for a long time. He writes the Large Park News column for Tourist Attractions and Parks magazine and has what I would think is a great perspective on the industry. So, Chad, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Dan. Really excited to be here.
Excellent. So first, let's start with just your background. So what got you into theme parks in the first place?
Well, I've always loved theme parks, just individually. But when I was teaching law school in Montgomery, started to do some research on the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which is the regulatory side, kind of the boring side, but it's the important side of what created Walt Disney World. And in digging down into that, I realized, wow, what Walt and Roy and their team created was really unprecedented in the history of local government in America.
So, and that from there, so you really picked it up. I mean, did you go a lot as a kid, or was this, I mean, you went kind of on normal vacations, but had you ever considered before that point that you wanted to write about theme parks? Or, I mean, where did that kind of your writing start?
Yeah, so I was teaching property law at Faulkner's Law School, and really was looking for something interesting to write a law review article about, something that was a little bit different out of the mainstream. And someone suggested, I heard that Disney created its own government to basically create Disney World. It's like, that sounds interesting. So I'd been to Disney World, 2 or 3 times before that, but never really, I wouldn't consider myself an aficionado at that point, but had really started to dig down deep. And I was like, wow, what they created was really, really unique. In some ways, what they created for people who like property or government law, I mean, that's not a big, I recognize it's not a big sample, but even for a Disney fan, what they created and what made Disney possible today is really one of the most unique governmental structures in the history of America.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me when I think about what they accomplished and reading through your book Project Future. And I mean, today, because we don't really see, there's so much expansion in Asia and in Dubai and everything happening, but we don't see much in the US. I mean, you'll hear a story of a park that's going to happen. I kind of know the answer to this question, but is there any way that anything near this scale could ever happen again, especially from someone like Disney?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the Harry Potter two worlds that Universal did was about as close as you can get. Um, to do this, you need a year-round climate, which Southern California and Central Florida have. A few other parts. I mean, Arizona, maybe parts of South Texas, but really, I think geography and now the ability to get from point A to point B in America so quickly is so much easier. I mean, you can fly Southwest from, the Midwest to California for just a couple $100s. Back then, that wasn't possible. The distance was bigger, and so back then, Orlando and Orange County, Anaheim were so much further apart that he might have thought about what about Texas? What about these other places? But today, I think the multi-day resort destination market in the U.S. has been tapped out between South Florida and or Central Florida and South Carolina, California.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about, I mean, because in your book, you talk about, I live in St. Louis, and you talk about the potential that Disney was going to open that indoor resort before Disney World in St. Louis with the riverfront. And it's hard for me to imagine, given the climate, even with the indoors, and given the way St. Louis is, to have something like that. The city as it stands now would be completely different if that had happened.
Yeah, so the whole St. Louis project, the waterfront project there, um, could have been transformative on a certain level, but not on the scale that a Disneyland or Disney World was. Because frankly, the big challenge there was Walt recognized it had to be a year-round venue, and the only way to do that in probably 85% of the country was to put it under roof. And that's really expensive. And that's why the St. Louis project, while it had a lot of the elements that you eventually saw in Southern California or you realized in Central Florida, haunted mansions and boat rides, it was still under a single roof, which even back then was really hard to do.
Yeah, because I mean, the whole thing is you want to have the space to grow and to expand. And the St. Louis riverfront is not that big. But this kind of transitions into what I really want to dig into, which is some of the things that are going on right now. And you mentioned kind of the multi day resort and why in Florida being tapped out. And we're seeing something right now where the Magic Kingdom in particular has just had crazy attendance this fall. And, I'm just curious where that's heading. I mean, from your perspective, covering the industry, do you see, I mean, this fall, September, October has been crazy. Do you see, I mean, how high can the Magic Kingdom go? And what is Disney going to run into a situation where they just can't keep up in terms of the capacity given the interest in the area and in that park?
So the big thing about Disney is that their ability to be flexible on park hours can in a the increase or decrease of park hours is the most efficient way to address demand because you have additional labor costs and wear and tear costs, but ultimately there's no capital cost. You're open an additional 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours on a day. So that'll probably be their first line of defense. But you look now, I was just in preparation for this, looking at some of the Disney or on property resorts. These are hotel rooms prices that have never been this high before in the history of Disney. I'm not just talking about in the last few years. I mean, even in the late 90s, early 2000s, where Eisner was really doing this stuff, these are some of the highest rates, if not the highest rates you've ever found at Disney World in the history of Disney World.
Yeah, and that raises an interesting point because, I mean, from what I've heard, the occupancy isn't that much higher, but yet they continue to raise prices and kind of maintain it in a sense. And we saw this also with I mean, it's been discussed. Disney obviously didn't give this as the main reason, but with the increases in annual passes and prices. And it seems to be that the prices keep going up. And where is the line where things like that tipping point or target where they put it to a point where they actually it hurts them. I don't think they're there yet.
One of the big challenges for Disney, and I mean, this is a really advanced podcast, so we're talking in the weeds here a little bit, but one of the really challenges for them is the Florida resident pass. That's a tricky pass because it increases volume in the restaurants and Epcot and things like that. But it's a really inexpensive pass comparatively. And it brings a lot of people into the gates. And now you're finding people from Tampa, from Ocala, from Gainesville, from Miami coming up and occupying the park for a day and then staying off property. Disney makes its money when they you occupy the park for the day and then you stay on property. Staying at the Hampton Inn or the Baymont or the Sleep Inn doesn't do them a lot of good. And so this resident pass, I wouldn't be surprised if Disney looks carefully at dramatically increasing the cost of the resident pass to levelize value they get from the residents versus people who travel in for and stay on the resort.
Right. It's a similar situation to what they're seeing. I mean, not at the extreme you're seeing in California, but a similar situation where people go for the day. They probably aren't buying the t-shirts, or maybe they don't even eat meals there. So while Disney gets the ticket prices, that's not really where they make their money. It wouldn't surprise me because given the demand and given the ease of travel, it just seems like I mean, I think this was done more. I mean, during the 2000s after 9/11, when they were struggling more with crowds, they did this to fill the parks, especially during kind of the off times. But now it seems like the off times are gone.
One of the most profitable lines of business for Disney World, is breakfast. Breakfast is a huge markup. It makes more money than all the other meals combined and snacks. Breakfast is a huge moneymaker. If you're staying at a Hampton Inn or a Baymont or a you name it, great hotels where they give you a free hot breakfast at Embassy Suites, that means you're eating into one of the largest profit factors. They want you at the all-star resorts, Caribbean Beach Resort, you name the resort, because you're buying that breakfast there makes them more money off that single breakfast than lunch and dinner combined.
Do you think, in a way, though, that by raising their ticket prices or even their pass prices, that it can almost be counterintuitive for them? Because, like, personally, if Disney would continue to raise prices, I'm going to be more likely to stay at an offsite condo or even maybe not a Hampton Inn, but something similar, kind of to kind of make my budget similar per trip. So could they actually, I know they need to make their profits, but could it be they're not getting the breakfast or not because they price themselves? People have to adjust their budgets.
So, really reliable people that I know at Disney have said is this is a great balance right now as Florida continues to grow. There's even talk, I mean, announced talk of a express rail line from Miami all the way up to Orlando. They're trying to balance how do we keep the Florida residents coming, right? That's because they create revenue, but they also spend less and their passes are less, but they also are reliable. I mean, if you're driving 30 minutes to go to Disney, that's something that can fill the gap versus increasing the guests who stay the night and eat breakfast. It's about staying the night, eating breakfast, and buying merchandise. If Disney was boiled down to three things: stay the night, hotel rooms, buy breakfast, buy merchandise, the three highest margins on all of their value.
That's really interesting because I hadn't heard much about the breakfast side of it. I mean, the other two seem like no brainers, but I could totally see it having spent money on breakfast at Disney resorts before. But transitioning a bit, I'm really curious because obviously we're seeing, based on what they announced at D23 and where they're heading, that particularly at the Hollywood studios, that Disney is really pretty much remaking that entire park. They've decided, we're going all in Star Wars, Toy Story, and we're going to spend the next few years completely redoing that park. Um, is this I mean, it seems like there's a lot more they're probably going to do with that park given what they've announced. What are the next few years going to be like at that park? Because I think it'll be amazing in 3 or 4 years. But I mean, from your perspective, what's it going to look like next year when? So I mean, it's already kind of there, and are they going to be able to draw a lot of people?
So, it's always tempting to be, I told you so, but I mean, you don't want to fall into that game. But I remember when the Star Wars purchase was made, very reliable sources said is that This is not going to be about updating Star Tours. This is not going to be about anything other than um, making Star Wars as intrinsic part of Disney as Goofy and Pluto are, right? I mean, it was
Mhm.
going to be everywhere, every park you go to, every aspect is they believe it had the staying power. Um, I call it Avatar Reflux. Um, the Avatar Animal Kingdom concept, Avatar, yeah, it sold a lot of tickets. Can you name a character in Avatar? Can the average American name a single character? If they can name the hero beyond that, all they know is something about blue people, right? And so they invested all this money in Avatar. What they didn't realize that Universal did, and to Universal's credit, they've required. I mean, I think their purchase of the Harry Potter rights caused Disney to purchase Star Wars because Avatar has no staying power. It'll sell a bunch of tickets for a new movie. No one knows it. There's no emotional connection. With Harry Potter, Star Wars, emotional connection. And Disney has made its money historically off of emotionally connected characters. And so the Avatar Reflux, they're going to do all that money in Animal Kingdom, and I'm sure it'll be great rides, and no one will make an emotional connection other than, well, it's a fun ride. The Disney and the Indiana Jones or the Star Wars Indiana Jones, all of these stuff they're really creating, they're going to make emotional connections with Indiana Jones, Luke Skywalker, whether it be dining, whether it be rides, whether it be shows.
Well, yeah, you could almost see a scenario where it's when we get to now, I'm hearing 2018 it'll be done, but let's say 2019, 2020, and all of a sudden the Hollywood Studios is easily the second most popular park at the resort and might even, I mean, it's not going to outdraw the Magic Kingdom, but it's just drawing like crazy if they play their cards right, which it's hard for me to envision now, but it's almost like it'll be a new park by the time they're finished.
Yeah, Hollywood Studios is a really challenging park, kind of like Magic Kingdom. So Epcot and Animal Kingdom have lots of growth capacity. Even in Epcot, which seems surrounded, still has a ton of growth capacity. Animal Kingdom almost unlimited. Magic Kingdom very limited, but Hollywood Studios, if it's as successful as it could be with the new Indiana Jones dining and attractions and the Star Wars, they're in real landlock, and it's going to be interesting to see how they deal with that. I mean, that's why I believe that they're going to spread Star Wars across the resort more because they recognize the Star Wars experience at Hollywood Studios could get overwhelmed. They need to have a Star Wars experience at Magic Kingdom, at Animal Kingdom, and at Epcot, in addition to Downtown Disney and all that. So you think, well, what could you do at Animal Kingdom? Well, think of the whole, you know, Return of the Jedi. It's a very
Right.
kingdom type environment. I I know today they're looking, the Imagineers are looking at how to incorporate Star Wars is if it's as successful as they think it's going to be this December and going forward into all of the parks. Hollywood Studios is the prologue to a much larger expansion.
That's so fascinating because it really, I mean, I could totally see it obviously at the Magic Kingdom where, I mean, there's Tomorrowland, even if you just simplify it, has several places that could easily, I mean, actually, pretty much almost anything but Space Mountain and maybe Buzz Lightyear technically could be rife for. But Epcot interests me because Epcot was my favorite park growing up. At Future World especially. I mean, as a kid in the 80s, I mean, it was just but it frustrates me. I still love the park, but it frustrates me by some of the attractions that are still there and some of the things that aren't happening. So what would I mean from your perspective, I know we're just kind of spitballing, but what would they could they I mean, how much Star Wars could we put into Future World or into Epcot?
So the first to go will probably be Ellen's Energy Adventure, whatever the official name is.
Yes.
They're working on plans right now how to completely transform that. It lacks relevance, and then you have Wonders of Life next to it. So you have big pieces of real estate that could be completely transformed. I think those are to be the most likely starts. The rest of Future World does pretty well. I mean, interventions you could do piecemeal type things, but I would look to Ellen's Energy Invention or Adventure and Wonders of Life. That area right there is to be the Star Wars kind of beachhead for Epcot.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, because you could separate that into its own land or area, whereas you're not. I mean, it's because it's over on its side, and even if you want to expand, you could go further and do something with mission space. I would imagine.
Well, even and probably mission space. I mean, you could do that, but even more likely is the parking lots that if you look on Google Earth and you walk around the parks, there's massive parking spaces behind um, energy adventure and wonders of life that could grow that way. I think you could, if what they think is going to happen, it's all predicated on the success of the movies going forward. But if they think the success that the movies do in Hollywood studios, I would expect to see a major, major investment in Epcot in in what I would call the Star Wars universe. Maybe not directly Star Wars rides, but that whole in a galaxy a long time ago, far away type of universe, which is going to has almost limitless expansion. You name all the characters. Heck, I mean, the funny thing about the new Star Wars that the last trilogy, which people pretty much critically panned, you can still name those characters. You may not like Jar Jar Binks, but you know that character. You know Ewan McGregor's character. Tell me an Avatar character you know.
I don't know any. I've only saw it once, which I think I'm pretty common. I mean, but um, the Animal Kingdom. I mean, the thing about Avatar is the movie. I feel like I mean they're going to do sequels maybe someday, but Cameron moves so slow with movies. But they have Joe Rohde working on this, and people's expectations are so low for that land, especially now with Star Wars coming in the future. People are almost looking past it. Is there any chance, I mean, that we could be surprised? I'm not saying that I expect the ride to be good, but that we could be surprised and somehow they could hit it out of the park despite the source material.
Oh, I mean, Joe is now obviously he loves his own shadow, but he is an amazingly creative person in developing immersive environments. Exhibition Everest is a great example of what Avatar can become. A very immersive environment, a very fun environment. You still, I mean, making the connection with a Yeti, kind of a generic, great character, but generic. There's not a
Mhm.
that's what you see with Avatar is that this really, really immersive. You got to go see it. I mean, the Everest queue is one of my favorites to walk through and just on a slow day when everyone's not trying to get on the ride, just kind of look at the level of details. I mean, they spent all that time in Nepal just to do this. I mean, it's amazing. I think you can get that out of Avatar. I think you'll get an amazingly immersive, interesting, thought-provoking, fun ride that has absolutely little, if any, emotional connection to the actual characters.
Right. And that's the difference, really. I mean, because Everest, I agree. I mean, it's one of those, and I mean, I guess it's just the way that park works, how short the lines are for that, that you can do that and stroll around and such. But in terms of immersive areas, that's up there with, I mean, the whole area. I mean, the mountain and the queue with anything they've done. And I agree the emotional thing is really the hurdle there. But I hadn't really heard much about Star Wars in that area. So looking at that park, if they were, I mean, where, I mean, you mentioned the expansion. Where in that park would the expansion best fit? Like where for Star Wars, I mean, where's the plot of land? Is it the conservation station area or is it a completely separate outside of what we currently walk through?
From what my people, the people I talk to there have said is that's the hardest one for them to analyze because they made such a big commitment to Avatar. They kind of have to let it play out. Um, Obvious potential examples. So Star Wars universe at Animal Kingdom will probably be slower to be implemented. In hindsight, an Ewok village that you experience more than an Avatar village, which is amazing similarities with the trees and all that,
Hmm.
would probably be a killer. But they realize, you know what? That's not going to happen. We're committed to Avatar. Conservation Station with the train ride there. If that train ride was transformed into another type of kind of like Universal has done with Hogwarts Express, the ride is extended through the transition through the through the train. Or frankly, the Finding Nemo show. It's one of the most expensive shows for them to do, and property. Wouldn't be surprised if that and some of the other areas in that park, they have the whole, twister coaster type little thing, and then the dinosaur ride. That's probably the most logical area. But of the four major parks, that'll be the last to be addressed. They feel like they have to give Avatar some breathing room, which is probably smart. You're investing all that money. Um, they'll give it breathing room. It'll be a nice place like Everest, no emotional connection. Then they'll bring in Star Wars.
Yeah, and that makes sense also because they're investing in the Rivers of Light show and the nighttime safari. So they're pretty much 2017 is kind of the year when, and actually somewhat next year, when they really are redoing the Animal Kingdom. Whereas somewhere like Epcot, with the exception of the Frozen change, is a park that I think, especially in its front half, I think they probably make sense for them to turn to after Hollywood Studios, just given based on, I mean, that park is beefed up by its food and wine, flower and garden festivals. But I mean, I still love it, but in terms of attractions draw, or I think it's of when Animal Kingdom kind of gets his act together in Hollywood Studios, that's going to be the fourth most interesting to some people.
Hollywood Studios is fairly easy to fix only because it's a fix is so small, right? There's so much land, so little land mass, and the same thing with Magic Kingdom to the extent you even really need to mess with that. Um, the thing about Epcot is it really has truly evolved into two parks. All the festivals you mentioned, Food and Wine, which is, here we are taping in middle of November. It's still going on. It started 2 months ago. Flower and Garden. World Showcases become a really unique experience. Future World, you don't hear much about. People like the Living Seas. They like the new test track thing, but a lot of people is Future World is a walkthrough to get to World Showcase. And so, Star Wars, does it have the ability, at least aspects of it, to turn Future World into we don't just walk through the front gates past the, kind of the tombstones with names on them and get to the great food and shows in World Showcase. Wow, maybe we stop in Mission Space, combined with Wonders of Life, combined with the energy adventure. That area right there, that could be the destination. And I know right now they're actually literally, from what I'm told, measuring out things in the parking lot, how they could expand that area to include a pretty immersive environment, even more immersive than what's going to happen at Hollywood Studios.
It's funny that it kind of kills me to hear that. Not because I don't want the things to come in, but because of my affinity for the earlier Epcot Center. But you're right. I mean, I will go on living with the land and, even ride that terrible imagination figment ride. But honestly, World Showcase is really what's drawing more of the crowds beyond Soarin' and Test Track and a little bit of Spaceship Earth. And so, but that does give them something to play with. And I think, I mean, Frozen's going to give them a little bump, but I agree. They can't have the front of the park have attractions that just eat crowds, but don't have any buzz to them at all.
Yeah, Soarin's a great attraction, and that whole pavilion there is kind of it's a little bit of an anomaly because you have Living with the Land, which is probably their most environmentally sound stewardship. It'd be hard to stop doing that. I mean, that they get a lot of
Mm.
credibility. I mean, that's AZA approved American Zoo and aquariums. I mean, it's a big deal over there, and that Living with the Land ride is still very very popular. Add in Soarin'. Living Seas is very popular, even just that little ride through. I mean, Journey Imagination, not as much, but you know, it's still kind of positioned there where it works. It's the entire left side, other than Test Track, that is woefully underserved. And you look at that and you're like, how do we disperse crowds? I mean, for Disney right now, with all this demand, it's about how do we convince crowds to go somewhere other than the Magic Kingdom and blow up that park and with a huge attendance and inefficient lines. And so now that's why Hollywood, they're trying to move people over there with Star Wars. They'll move in over there with Epcot. I mean, they're very very smart about that. But their biggest problem is that they still have some of these park spaces that are just underutilized, and that's the entire left-handed side, other than Test Track. Mission Space is woefully underserved. Wonders of Life not even open except for special events, and then Energy Adventure, it consumes a lot of people. No one goes to it. No, it's kind of like, oh, there's no line there. That entire left side of Epcot, it could be a huge, huge crowd absorber for them.
No, I agree. And I think that they're, like you said, the land and the living seas are still popular and still drawn, especially now with them adding the new Soren movie, which is going to come in next year. Is that will, I mean, that ride does not need a bump, but that will give it a probably even a bit more of a bump for next year while they figure out the more long term plans. So another thing that's obviously opening right now is Disney Springs, which we've seen recent, the Morimoto opened and the Boathouse. I mean, having been there when they were doing construction and finding it maddening to go to that area, but it's getting closer and it should be done, fairly soon. How much impact do you think having this new area could have with locals and even with guests in terms of how the resort functions?
Yeah, so I'll be completely honest with you. It's completely a race to the bottom in terms of Disney Springs, in terms of absorbing crowds. I mean, what Disney recognizes, they're on a hot run. They need to get people other than just in Magic Kingdom right now. Um, and so this plays into that. It's some locals. The locals, as we said before, they don't stay the night, don't eat breakfast. So maybe you can get the hyper locals, which are the people within 25, 30 miles, come eat dinner there instead of going to the Mall of Orlando or Galleria or whatever those other places are. Um, the problem with Disney Springs is that it's not really clear what it is. Um, it's a really amped up version of City Walk, maybe better than something I drive, but it's not a luxury dining place, even though it has an amazing dining place. It's just a little. It feels like a little bit of patchwork, and so yeah, it'll absorb crowds. It's going to serve basically as a crowd sponge for Disney, which right now they need because the parks are so full. But if I was staying at Disney, I'd probably stay at Port Orleans and go to Old Man Island, spend the day there, then try to even get on that boat and go down to Disney Springs because it's an increasingly generic experience there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It seems like there'll be some amazing places, but it's a bit of a mishmash in terms of what they're putting in. I mean, they're finding, popular chefs or oh, this is an interesting idea. Let's do this. And people are going to be appreciative, me too, because it's, after the construction, it's more of a completed place and there's a lot of options. But yeah, I wouldn't make the trip or make a special effort just to go there beyond curiosity. I would think personally, but I'm sure they're going to do well. I would expect.
Yeah, I mean Steve Schussler, who is the creative genius behind Rainforest Cafe, Schussler Creative. They did T Rex and aquarium and other stuff there. Great guy, and they've got a great collection there. But if the thing about Orlando is more touring in a lot of ways. You can get great dining in downtown Orlando now. There's a local crowd with the medical projects they're doing and all the other stuff they're doing around the Citrus Bowl. I mean, they're really creating a culture of you don't have to go to Disney to get interesting things to eat or shop. And so their biggest challenge with Disney Springs is um, it is a great example is when you're walking through the old Paradise Island or whatever it is, and we're near where Adventures Club used to be. There's a place there. It's just a food place. It's a food place from around the world, but there's nothing special about it. It's something you could. It's really, really high end food court cuisine with decent views of a man-made lake. And so, what did they really do to create that? I mean, the West Side is even worse with it's just a at least that's just a strip mall and people recognize it. It's just a straight line with look the bowling alley and all that kind of stuff. And so what Disney has basically said with the whole downtown Disney environment, we have to amp this up to absorb crowds, and hopefully we convince crowds to leave Magic Kingdom and spend their money here, because otherwise, as their biggest danger is this popularity. If Magic Kingdom, those lines, even with all the new fancy fast passes, all those lines deter people from going. They're going to not want to come back, and they'll check out Harry Potter. I mean, right now, Harry Potter, more than ever in the history of Universal versus Disney, has made a vacation that's based at Universal a viable alternative rather than just a let's run down to Universal.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Universal because I almost compare what they're doing right now. I mean, Harry Potter is a different thing, but how frequently they're opening attractions and what their resorts, kind of to what Eisner was doing in the 90s during what he called the Disney decade. And I feel like they have benefits of the compact space. They have, like you mentioned, you can go on site there, you can do the front of the line with most of the attractions or early entry in terms especially of a short kind of relaxed trip, especially if you have older kids. It seems like Disney's, despite all the great interesting things they're going to be doing, may have a hard time combating that. But how far can Universal go with this expansion? They're opening Volcano Bay, Sapphire Falls. I mean, is there, in the next few years, can they continue to grab market share on this, or is there like a line that they're going to hit?
Yeah, so they're geographically limited, and they're I'll say this about Universal. I mean, I think some of their historically their leadership has been pretty weak, um, but they've really kind of realized that okay, within this small footprint, we can maximize the dollars per square foot. And so there's almost no land in that whole footprint they have now that is not generating revenue. I mean, it's amazing how efficient they've been without causing the different experiences to creep into each other. So you can say at the Royal Pacific and the new moderate level hotel, they're close, but there's still a separation. So they can become, I mean, here's the thing is, I mean, so I'm here in Huntsville, Rocket City, America. And of the three families, three friends I've known who've gone to Orlando in 2015, where I actually sat down with them, one went with the sole purpose of going to Disney. Two went to go to Universal. Now it's Harry Potter driven, and I think without the new novels, that has a shorter lifespan than a Star Wars, which is renewing itself unless J.K. Rowling changes her mind and writes more books. But here's the thing: they can continue to service a market. Up until now, it was all three Lowe's hotels, which are pretty expensive. If they can get into that, $100 to $160 per night rate, there's gonna be people who are saying, I could stay at Caribbean Beach Resort again, or I could try one of the two new moderate resorts at Universal. Universal will never compete head to head because it doesn't have the land mass. When they sold off the Lockheed land or whatever land that was, they sold off a while back. They basically gave in to a third park. There's never be a third park there. It's not possible. But they can sure make, after the Magic Kingdom and the second day at Disney, a tough decision whether to go to the third Disney park or go over to Islands of Adventure. That's going to be a really tough decision for a lot of vacationers.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. It's amazing how smart they've gotten because and I think a lot of the things we've talked about in the past half hour in terms of Disney's plans looking ahead, they're not all in response, but I was surprised to hear recently, even with Star Wars, where when you heard it announced, you thought that's coming in 2020, 2021, to hear that they're starting construction so quickly and that they're pushing to get done in a shorter time span. I feel like that especially is being driven by what Universal is doing. And especially in Hollywood, where with Universal opening Harry Potter there, they could have a really big dent on Disneyland, I would think.
If you were to get a guy like Tom Staggs, who's, in my opinion, one of the best leaders that Disney parks have had in a long time, obviously he's transitioned to a new role, but I mean, so much better than a guy like Jay Rasulo, which was really a dark period for Disney parks. But Tom Staggs reinvigorated it, and one of the things that he was really good at is understanding the creative side. And if you put him into a lie detector test, he would probably say, "Wow, Harry Potter scared the tar out of us." Not because we're worried about, thousands and millions of people leaving, but the revenue per square foot they were getting taking away. I mean, Disney is predicated on a multi-day. It goes back to the local thing we talked about. After day 2 or 3, they really start making their money off you. That's a lot of breakfast you're buying from them. When they started seeing, wow, people, they're even staying at Caribbean Beach for 4 nights, but they're buying a 2-day pass, that scared the tar out of them because that means they're going over to whether it be Legoland or more likely, which Legoland has been a big hit against Disney, but more likely Universal or even in some cases SeaWorld. And so once they saw this metric. We're getting room night stays, we're getting shorter pass stays, room nights staying where they are, going up, people buying shorter passes. That means they're leaking down to Legoland or Universal. That probably kept Tom Staggs up at night a lot and probably single handedly led to the purchase of Star Wars at a very, very high premium.
Right. And in a sense it's good. I mean, for fans or for people that want to see movement in the parks. I mean, the flip side is obviously they have to pay for them. So you see, I mean, Universal especially, and both Disney and Universal are doing this, but Universal brilliantly set up the situation where to do Harry Potter, if you're going to do that 1 day trip, you're essentially going to pay the park, the park to park pass, like you mentioned, the price per, per square foot. Someone going there for a 1 day trip, let's say a family of four, just on tickets, you could inch close to $800. So Universal with Harry Potter not only is pulling from Disney, they've also found a way to have you spend quite a lot per day.
There's a lot of names that people don't hear that really have a huge impact on the industry. When I was writing Project Future, for example, Paul Hellowell, which a lot of people don't recognize. He's a lawyer based out of South Florida. He was just as transformative in making Disney World what it was as Roy was and others. There's another name. I'm not putting her on the same level as Hellowell, but Alice Norsworthy. That's a great name to remember. She was an exec at Disney. She came over to Universal. She had a position in between. I think it's a cruise line or something like that. Um, Brought a lot of that Disney acumen over. And so someone like Alice Norsworthy, who says is it's about these connections, these immersive environments, whatever her position was, a marketing, EVP or whatever it was the impact of that thought process. I remember talking to her when she first moved there. Um, their PR people are nightmare to deal with. Tom Schroeder and those guys, some of the worst in the industry. But I actually had a chance to visit with her, and um, you saw that level of detail. It's like a George Kalogridis over at Disney. These people who really get the storytelling side. Universal has finally embraced that storytelling side because of people like Alice and others over there. So as long as Universal keeps telling interesting stories, they have a chance to at least become an alternative destination, or in some cases, a primary, and then they leak to Disney, which changes the paradigm completely.
Right. I mean, I'm really curious to see how much they can accomplish, like storytelling wise, with Kong next year, because just seeing pictures of that structure, which is just massive, and how low the height limit or height requirement is. I mean, granted, you're probably not going to see a lot of 37, 38-inch kids on that ride, but you can see that they're shooting for more than just another thrill ride to drop into Islands of Adventure. They're really trying to create another destination on the other side of that park.
Yeah, I mean, I remember. So, it's probably a decade now ago or so. You had a really, really sharp lady named Cynthia Gordon. She ran a lot of the PR and other stuffs in Universal, and kind of really pressing some of those folks back then to take some risks, to do something different. Either Blue Man Group, kind of things like that, and there was kind of this culture of like we're happy being second place, you know, and really kind of pressed that. It went away a little bit, but now you have Universal growing up and wondering to itself, do we have to be satisfied with second place? What they're creating, the dollars they're investing, and now that they have, a big, huge corporate parent like Disney has, they have the capacity to invest in some major, major things. And their, frankly, capital investment per square foot is significantly higher per square foot of the overall property than Disney is right now. That's a big deal. I mean, it's not the end all be all, but that's a big deal. Universal is investing more in its actual realized property than Disney is. And that's something that's going to pay dividends if they continue storytelling. If they go back to the whole, let's put the rocket coaster, which is one of the worst things they've ever done. No,
Yes.
no connection, nothing. It was just ooh, look at this. There's a new ride mechanism we can do. That was the low point. If they go back to storytelling, like they started to do with The Mummy, and now with Harry Potter, and now with Kong, and even Transformers, if they storytell, they have a real chance to put a dent in the multi-day vacation at Disney.
Well, great. I have one more big question related to Disney and Universal here. Disney, like you mentioned, has such the emotional connection, and people go as a kid, like I did, then they bring their kids, like I do, and Harry, because like you mentioned, J.K. Rowling is writing more books. I mean, there's story, going to do a musical relating to, or a play relating to, I don't think it's a musical. Don't quote me on that. To Harry Potter's son, which who knows, that may get, a couple years from now, we may be talking about that as a new book or movie or whatnot. If that continues and people that are going now as kids in 10, 15 years go to, they have their memories from Harry Potter, is there a scenario where it's not going to flip totally, but where those legacy fans don't really automatically pick Disney, that they have these memories of Harry Potter, and when they go back they're taking their kids to that?
That's a great question, Dan, because the one of the things is I've, whether it be the Large Park Report or other articles I wrote about, um, Universal's bet on Harry Potter. The challenge is that right now, at least, the creator of Harry Potter, Ms. Rowling, has said she's basically done telling the new stories. She may enhance, like you suggested, some existing stories, but there won't be another generation. Compare that to Star Wars, where I was born in '72, and so went through that first trilogy. The second trilogy kind of lousy, but there's still some people. It still touched a generation. This new one, I have kids ranging from 3 to 13, 14, and they'll be experienced by this new one. That story keeps on being told. The Harry Potter challenge is 10 years from now, is it just look like Buck Rogers, or does it look like Battlestar Galactica or some other popular thing in the moment, or does it have an enduring power? New creative content requires that, and that's why Iger's credit. Um, they bought Star Wars not for what it was, but what it could be, the future storytelling potential. And so I think with Harry Potter, there are people at Universal who probably, whether they're religious or not, pray every night that J.K. Rowling decides to tell another set of Harry Potter stories. And that's the future for Universal if she does.
Oh, I imagine there are plenty of people at the movie studios that have the exact same prayer all the time, because that made so much money and merchandise, and let's just go down the list. So you were involved. I have a few questions just at the end here, but you wrote Project Future. You edited the 40 years of Walt Disney World book. Have you thought about ever going back and writing another book? Are you currently involved in anything like that?
Yeah, so Project Future is going to be expanded upon in 2016. Um, we found, I mean, Project Future, what it isn't a guidebook. It isn't a here's why they made this great Disney ride. Project Future was all about telling the story on a really in-depth level. And so we're going to tell the story even more deeply. We're going to expose people to the documents that, whether it be some of the things which were our source material, that if you're really a truly deep Disney fan, you want to figure how this got started, you'll be able to probably by summer of 2016 gain access to those documents for a nominal cost.
That is fascinating.
It's
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, the funny thing is, I'm a recovering lawyer. I mean, a lawyer by trade. I don't practice law anymore. But one of the things I realized in doing the research for Project Future, why I felt so confident is there's a whole trove, a treasure trove of depositions from the late '60s involving some land transactions. The thing you need to know if you're a non-lawyer about a deposition, it's under oath and it's contemporary, and so it's most about as reliable as you can possibly get. And some of the information shared in those documents were what was going on under oath right at the time, not, someone recollecting an autobiography, from 30, 40 years ago. And so we're gonna make some of those records, which I went to the National Archives and got copies of, and other places, make those available, not just for historians, but also for fans of what Disney became. I mean, Paul Hellawell, Bob Foster, Roy Disney, Joe Fowler, all those guys, they changed the way America vacations because of their vision in Disney World.
Well, that sounds amazing. I mean, for, somebody like myself who's interested in a lot of the stories beyond just the rides themselves, this sounds like it's going to be definitely on my radar for next year. If anyone wants to learn more about what you're doing or about this book, is there anywhere on the internet where people can follow you?
Yeah, so the best bet, Project Future, we're just celebrate our fifth anniversary, and I appreciate you touching base. It's actually the enduring aspect of it. It continues to be bought just as quickly now as it was 5 years ago in a lot of ways. You can go to, we have a Facebook page for Project Future. That'll be ramping up probably in February of 2016 as we gear up for this new release of first person, really interesting information. And so Project Future on Facebook is your best bet. And if anyone ever wants to follow up with questions, you emailed me at Chad, Chad, another D, Chad D Emerson at gmail.com. I'd love to share all the information we have. It's a fascinating story, Dan, and it's a story which is enduring because it's not an exaggeration to say it changed the way we recreate in this country with what Walt did and Roy did and Paul Hellawell did and Bob Foster did and others did in a swampland in the middle of the state of Florida.
No, and I don't think you're overstating it at all. And if you haven't read Project Future, I would definitely suggest checking it out. And Chad, thanks so much for being on the podcast, and I definitely want to have you back next year when you're getting closer to releasing this new materials to talk more about that.
Thanks for the invitation, Dan, and really enjoyed our last 53 minutes and 28 seconds.
Excellent. Thanks so much to Chad for being on the podcast. I think it was a great conversation, which had a lot of information that I hadn't been aware of. And you should definitely go like his Facebook page at Project Future or shoot him an email if you want more information. If you want to know more about me, you should go to tomorrowsociety.com, read the blog, or subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. And if you like this podcast, I'd love it if you could go give us a rating or review over at iTunes. The music for this podcast is composed by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and I'll talk to you again very soon.